you know how to participate in today's event. You'll have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. However, if you'd prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed for you. You'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the question pane of the GoToWebinar control panel to the right side of your screen. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording. I'd now like to take a moment to introduce our presenters for today. Professor Rachel Morton, Co-Chair ACTA Research Prioritisation Reference Group, Director of Health Economics, NHMRC Clinical Trial Center, Facility of Medicine and Health, University of Sydney. We also have today Associate Professor Haitham Tufaha, Co-Chair ACTA Research Prioritisation Reference Group, Health Technology Assessment Leader, NHMRC Research Fellow, Center for Business and Economics, Health, University of Queensland. Also joining us today, we have our coordinator, Anita Balagurunathan from ACTA. It is at this point in the program that I would like to hand the microphone over to you, Rachel.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Laurie. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet today, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Welcome to ACTA's Research Prioritisation webinar. I'm just going to bring up the first slide. This is really the takeaway slide, and we will provide a copy of this for all of today's webinar participants. This outlines ACTA's new 10-step framework for research prioritisation, but a little bit more about that in a minute. We have a poll question to get you started and test out your technology. Have you participated in a research prioritisation exercise where topics, as in general themes or ideas, topics, or proposals, as in specific clinical trial studies, were ranked? Please select either yes or no. Okay, just waiting for a couple more people to cast their vote. All right, last call. Okay, Laurie, can you show us the results, please? So we have of participants today, it's almost split 1/3 and 2/3. So 2/3 of people have not participated this in a formal way, and 1/3 have, which is a great balance for questions and answers that we're going to have at the end of the webinar, where some of you will have experience and be interested in some further refinement perhaps, whereas the remainder have not participated in this personally themselves. Okay, just moving on to the next slide. Suppose your clinical trial network focused on reducing childhood overweight and obesity, and you only had the resources to do one of the above large-scale school-based randomised controlled trials. Trial A, parenting classes of healthy eating and exercise, or Trial B, sit-stand desks in school classrooms. Which one of these trials would you choose to do, and what criteria might you use to help you make that decision? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So why prioritise? The key reason is that there's an opportunity cost to doing research that doesn't then inform clinical practice or decision making. So we know that there are limited resources, particularly in terms of trained staff, but also in terms of participants. We may not be able to do all of the trials that we'd like because we might be competing for participants, and of course funds. So we want to make optimal use of the resources we have that generates the evidence that's going to be most responsive to a range of stakeholders' needs. And many of you will be familiar with the Lancet series on reducing waste, but you might not have seen this one particular paper that's about reducing waste through research prioritisation. So there's some worthwhile concepts to draw upon in there. The next slide really outlines some questions that John Ioannidis has posed with his typical, controversial title, Why Most Clinical Research is Not Useful. And a lot of these sorts of ideas have formed the basis of the criteria for whether we should pursue particular studies. Is there a health problem that's big or important enough? Has prior evidence been assessed? Is the study large enough to be sufficiently informative? Does the research reflect real life? Does the research reflect top patient priorities? Is the research good value for money? Is it feasible? And then in terms of how it's reported so that there's transparency. So these are quite useful questions to ask yourself around any of the research that we do. Particularly for ACTA, we've been looking at methods to develop the conduct of trials and the best use of evidence. And so Group F formed a couple of years ago with the goal of ensuring that trials conducted by the networks identified research questions with the greatest possible impact on health outcomes, and that good practice principles and guidelines were available to CTNs. And these are guidelines that are available to not only people doing the research, but also to people funding the research. I'll just go back. Sorry, you can see the members of the group, the board sponsors and membership here, including heads of CTN networks and Department of Health representatives. So research prioritisation in this framework occurs at two levels. You can prioritise the topic. So if you were, for instance, a perinatal or a neonatal group, you might decide that you need to prioritise around the types of topics or areas that you would work on. Reducing caesarean births, might be maternal education, might be related to reducing neonatal or longer term morbidity. The second level of prioritisation occurs at the proposal level. So let's say you had a topic was reducing caesarean births, but you might have a number of different trials or proposals that focus on that question. And so there's a slightly different range of criteria that might be appropriate to use at the proposal or topic level. The ACTA framework takes both of these levels into account. Over the last 2 years, we've undertaken 3 activities to inform the framework, and I'll go through what we found. The first was a pragmatic review of both published literature, but also working documents from research organisations, clinical trials networks, and also funders. The second was a survey of CTNs and then some in-depth interviews to find out what current research prioritisation approaches were being taken among the clinical trial networks. And then we had some broader stakeholder consultation, particularly with government funders. And the reason we've gone through this very comprehensive background is to ensure that the ACTA framework is fit for purpose, it's practical, that it does allow flexibility in its application depending on the needs of the organisation. So our pragmatic review findings, standard PRISMA flow diagram here. You can see the reasons for exclusion, but the end message is that we identified 68 articles that were included in the synthesis. And the 3 main approaches from these publications and organisation documents were interpretive or consensus-based approaches, quantitative or metric-based approaches, or a combination of the two. And I'll go through some examples so you get an idea of these. The interpretive approaches included the James Lind Alliance approach, which some of you may be familiar with, Delphi processes seeking consensus, so multiple rounds of surveys, a face-to-face workshop or consensus meeting, or this World Cafe Docmocracy. Quantitative approaches were around having specific data that helped ranking of topics or proposals. Value of information, which we'll talk a little bit more about, prospective payback, and burden of disease. So some of these have been used by Australian and New Zealand CTNs, but we find that these are sort of lesser known and lesser used. And then comprehensive or blended approaches include CHNRI and forced ranking. So in detail, here are some of the example approaches that were most common. Essential National Health Research, ENHR, involves research ideas being gathered from a range of stakeholders, criteria developed, and then consensus, usually in a face-to-face roundtable, to decide on the ranking. And what you can see here is that there's a traffic light system for really the quality of each of these principles: engagement, transparency, and use of existing evidence. If we go across now to James Lind Alliance, this brings patients, carers, and health professionals or researchers together, forms an interim priority ranking, and then within a workshop setting, a final priority ranking is generated, usually for the top 10 or top 20 areas where research needs to be undertaken. The engagement with multiple stakeholders is very high. One of the limitations is the transparency is quite low, because it's difficult to know how people have moved from the initial list of generating topics to the final list of the top 10 or 20. But use of the existing evidence is high through background searches for systematic reviews of existing evidence. Another area that has been shown to be quite useful in terms of characterising the value of money or the value of doing a new trial is what's known as value of information, or VOI analysis. And what this does is it acknowledges that pre a new trial, clinical decisions are being made under conditions of uncertainty, in that you may not have perfect information to inform whether a particular drug or treatment or even model of care should be given to a particular population. And hence that's often why a trial is done. In addition to for a clinician having to choose whether to give or withhold an intervention in a particular case, they may also consider whether further information is necessary to reduce the chance of making a wrong decision, or perhaps reduce the chance of causing harm. And so intuitively, the more uncertainty there is with the current clinical situation, the more valuable doing a new trial that answers that question would be. So what value of information analysis is a particular statistical approach or statistical technique that utilises all the data that's known before the trial to predict the expected return on investment through doing a new trial. And by completing this value of information analysis, new trials or proposals can be ranked in order of the highest expected return. And that's one way that you might prioritise your research. So going on now to the survey of the clinical trial networks, and this was presented at the NHMRC Research Translation Symposium in 2018. And what you can see along the bottom of this graph are a number of different criteria that CTNs used. And on the y-axis is the number of CTNs or coordinating trial centres. And what you can see here is that most groups thought that most criteria were important. A couple were less concerned about the capacity building, and there were a couple of other criteria not listed here that were one-offs. So that showed us that people were certainly taking into consideration a lot of these criteria, but it was like a rating. We don't really know how important those criteria were to individual groups. So then we followed up with some 1-hour interviews with the principal investigator or the chair of the CTN and the executive officer. And from these interviews, 6 specific themes came out, and these are listed here in this petal diagram: governance structure, research prioritisation process, role of funders, criteria, challenges, and consumer involvement. So the governance structure was really important because all of the CTNs we spoke to differed in their structure. Some were part of a bigger professional association. Some were a part of a major international consortium. Others were a university collaboration or an independent entity, such as a company limited by guarantee. And because of the structures, they had different compositions in terms of scientific advisory committee or central executive committees, and the representation on those committees, and therefore their decision-making power about what the group would do. The next theme was about the process itself. So this was who was involved, if that had experience with research prioritisation, who was involved in that process. And for instance, was there formal involvement of consumers? Were there representatives from each of the specific committees? Did it come down to a vote from the chair of the group? And if the group had annual scientific meetings, was this done sort of face-to-face, or was it done separately via email or a ballot? So there were some interesting differences in the actual process. The third theme was about the role of funders, and everybody acknowledged that the criteria that large competitive funding schemes use, such as the NHMRC or the Medical Research Future Fund or HRC in New Zealand, is that the criteria given to the different schemes, particularly for funding clinical trials, such as scientific quality, significance, and track record, those criteria were often the criteria that groups used, but there may have been additional criteria. And therefore, the criteria for some groups, in essence, became fundability. So if a proposal was fundable, then it may have met the criteria of the specific clinical trial network. And the fourth theme was consumer involvement. And again, this was on a continuum, with some groups having consumers who were experienced to the point where they're actually proposing studies and working actively with other researchers on designing and conducting those studies, through to having input as a member of an executive or the board or a scientific committee. And this was particularly apparent at the topic level prioritisation. Down to other groups where consumers had limited input into research prioritisation. The challenges that groups listed were really about resourcing this process. It's another thing for trials groups to do, and they need some infrastructure funding, they need time people to be able to do this, although they all thought that it was an important exercise to do, particularly when they've really developed their portfolio of trials. And one of the other challenges was that there can be unequal distribution of decision-making authority among the members. And the challenge was how to ensure equal representation of all voices. And finally, the criteria themselves, which we're going to talk about, and how then groups might make trade-offs between those criteria. So the criteria at the topic level fairly much were dictated by the group's mission, the objectives, the current landscape that people were doing research in that particular operating system, and potentially also the group's strategic plan. For proposals, the criteria that came out quite strongly were related to significance of the study question, the scientific quality of the trial design, the feasibility, particularly the preparedness of the group to be able to run this trial, the fundability, as I'd mentioned, equity, and also importance to consumers. Of note, there was little use of other quantitative criteria, such as value for money or return on investment, despite people acknowledging that it was probably important. And then finally, stakeholder consultation. So our draft framework was developed on these 3 pieces of information, and we took them to the Department of Health and NHMRC and MRFF to talk about this from a funder's perspective, how well the framework might be used. And the sorts of topics that came up here was, and this was last year, although it could have been written in January, how they might balance funding for chronic diseases versus emerging priorities, such as infectious diseases or natural disasters. And so having some flexibility for the framework or the allowance for contingencies that may need to be prioritised outside of perhaps regular calls. There's quite a bit of discussion about targeted calls versus open calls for research. Also discussions about how to weight the criteria used. Should the criteria be equally weighted, or should there be a higher or lower percentage for some criteria and not others? And one discussion has been around when there is a difference between something that is extremely important to consumers, but potentially there's no testable intervention available, whether things like feasibility or scientific quality should have the same weighting as importance to consumers. So there's some interesting discussion around that. And then finally, allowing the fundability of the trial to determine priority. So these are the 5 criteria, and I'll just step through these. Relevance, which is about why should we do it? It includes the broader burden of disease, equity considerations, and the current knowledge gap. Appropriateness, should we be doing this trial, including scientific rigour and the ability to answer the question. Significance or impact, what are we going to get out of it? What is going to be developed in terms of capacity and also innovation. Feasibility is fairly straightforward. And then value for money. Is the proposed research potentially cost effective? Is it going to yield a good return on the investment of all this time and labour? And then that brings us to the 10-step framework, which Haytham is going to go through in part 2 of the webinar. So just to summarise the points I've made, that research prioritisation is extremely important to make the best use of our resources in generating high quality evidence that's going to impact practice and policy and improve health outcomes. that the process should be carefully planned, and we need to consider the scope, objectives and resources available. It should be inclusive, it should be transparent, but able to be adapted as needed. And that we would suggest quantitative approaches should be considered to maximise return on research investment. Okay, I'm now going to hand over to Associate Professor Haitham Tufaha, who's the co-chair with me for Reference Group F, and he comes from the University of Queensland, and then after that we'll have the Q&A.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you everyone for being with us today. In the coming 20 minutes or so, I will take you through the 10 steps of the framework, and I will be discussing future directions to develop tools to facilitate its implementation and practice. As you can see, this 10-step framework is adapted from Nasser et al., and it is mainly based on the results of the systematic review, the survey, the interviews that we had with various stakeholders, and the input from the experts on the committee on Group F. Before I proceed, I would like to pause for a minute and highlight the principles that guided the development of our framework. So this framework is actually guided by a number of principles. We wanted any research prioritization process to be clear and transparent for the different stakeholders involved and the people who will be using the results of research. We also wanted the process to be equitable and inclusive of all stakeholders. The methods included in the framework should be robust and acceptable. But at the same time, we wanted the framework to be pragmatic and fit for purpose. So CTNs can adapt the framework to fit the purpose of the prioritization exercise and also taking into consideration the available resources. And finally, we also wanted the framework to enhance accountability and to be self-improving. So we have a continuous process of improvement to maximize the outcomes and benefits of the prioritization exercise. With this in mind, I would like also to emphasize that we are not prescribing how people should be prioritizing their research activity, but rather this framework is intended to provide general best practice guidelines. And as you can see, although we have 10 steps, that framework can be adapted to the needs of the different clinical trial networks. And depending on the situation and objectives of the particular organization and available resources, some of the steps can be skipped and some steps may be revisited as the process proceeds. So it's a flexible and adaptive way of prioritizing research according to the needs of your organization. Talking about the steps in detail, so the first step, which is a very critical step, is the step to form a leadership team. We need a group of people who can engage with stakeholders, coordinate activities, implement and disseminate recommendations, and evaluate the process at the end. Now, how the group is structured and who should be represented, this is something that the network can decide on, but in general, the structure of the group should be appropriate. It should be representative of the stakeholders involved, and it should present their values and the aims and objectives of the prioritization exercise. Now, this group can be established as for one-off purpose or as a standing committee if we wish for the prioritization to be an ongoing activity within the clinical trial network. we should be always mindful of any conflict of interest between, of course, the members of the leadership group and outcomes of the research prioritization exercise. Now, the group, the leadership team should be asking themselves very important questions, and they should be deciding on the scope and objectives of the exercise. So we should be clear about why are we doing this and who will benefit from the research prioritization exercise, who will be involved in the process. And are we talking about long-term or short-term timeframes? And what resources we've got to achieve this research prioritization task. And if we need information or data, for example, such as burden of disease, or we need the results of a systematic review, how are we going to obtain these? And remember that there is no perfect way of prioritizing research. It is always a matter of understanding the scope and objectives of the process and the resources that we have and what exactly we need to achieve at the end of that process. An important step for the leadership team is to engage with stakeholders, and stakeholders can be engaged at various stages. They can be part, of course, of the leadership team. They can be involved in and consulted when we want to decide on research prioritization topics, or to in the process of ranking and deciding which proposals, for example, to fund or prioritize. In all cases, we need to make sure that we have diverse representation, and we need to have balanced representation in terms of gender, socioeconomic status, and geographical location. I would like also to remind you that ACTA has developed an in-depth toolkit, a very useful and practical tool to enhance consumer engagement in research. And you can find the link to that tool on the slide. An important component of the framework, and Rachel has touched base on the criteria. So the presence of a criteria will ensure that the discussions are focused and we consider all, so there is no important elements are overlooked. So everything is that we need to consider is really considered. So any criteria that we want to include should be appropriate for the objective of the process, and again, consider the resources that we have. And the criteria should be also practical and realistic. So we need to know whether we can actually provide the tools and methods to assess the criteria in a proper way, and to provide information that can guide the discussions at the end. And taking various perspectives actually is important. So from a funder's perspective, maybe value for money or research, the return on investment is something of a particular interest. While for most clinical trial networks, they may focus on ensuring the merit that the proposals meet the merit criteria, for example, of scientific rigor or relevance, significance, and feasibility. Now, after we decide on the criteria, we need to have clarity about how to use them. And normally, or typically, particularly if any of you have been involved, in, for example, NHMRC panels, we tend to score proposals after assessing them against the criteria, and there are weights that reflect the importance of those criteria to the decision-making process. So, for example, some organization may place a weight of 40% for scientific quality, 30% for significance, and 20% for feasibility. Now, there are various methods available to elicit those weights. Those can be decided by the leadership team based on their assessment of the importance of various criteria. But there are also formal methods to elicit the weights and preferences that are based on trade-offs between the criteria. This might include methods such as discrete choice experiments, and I will come to these shortly. Now, after we have decided on the leadership team, the scope objectives, who we want to involve, the criteria, and how to score and weight the criteria. We need to generate a list of topics and ideally translate those topics into more specific research questions to answer. Now, the way we identify topics, there are various ways to do this. We can engage the public through public consultation. We can have targeted consultations of experts. We can have literature reviews to identify research gaps. And then we can also translate these into specific projects with specific research questions, which we call a PICO, where we have a clear population, intervention, comparator, and outcome. Now, this is important if we want to translate idea generation exercise and translate this into building clear research agenda. Some organizations do both. Some organizations do one of these two activities. But regardless, we need to come to the point where we have to decide and prioritize a final list of topics or proposals. And here we suggest three approaches. So one approach is deliberations or discussions among participants, where they discuss the proposals or topics, and they decide which proposals should be prioritized. Alternatively, we can have a multiple criteria decision analysis, which is a more structured approach where proposals are assessed against the criteria that we've chosen and they are scored on a particular scale, let's say from 1 to 5, 1 for poor quality, 5 being excellent. Then weights applied, and we calculate aggregate scores for each proposal. And then we will rank proposals or topics according to their scores. A third approach would be to use analytical methods or quantitative approaches to compare costs and benefits and estimate return on investment. Now, it's important to remember that we're not saying that these three approaches are mutually exclusive. In fact, they can be used together. So, for example, we can use the multiple criteria decision analysis to make sure that the proposals that we have match certain criteria and pass certain threshold. And then we create a short list of proposals that can be subject to analytical approaches to evaluate value for money. And then the information from the multi-criteria analysis and the return on investment assessment can be presented to the committee at the end, and final decisions can be made about the final list of proposals to fund, for example, or to prioritize. The use of any of these approaches depends on the scope of the exercise and how much resources we have to support the analytical approach, for example, or to do the multiple criteria decision analysis. And at the end of any prioritization process, it's important to have clear and transparent reporting of the results to the stakeholders. And it's always important to make sure that we have sets of indicators. Those can be for the process itself, such as transparency, inclusiveness, adherence to budget and timeline. And also we can have outcome indicators, although these may take some time to capture, such as having successful grant proposals. For example, the CTNs might be interested in making sure that their proposals get funded, or successful completion of trials or publications, and as long-term outcomes such as looking at the implementation and impact of trial outcomes. So this is a summary of the 10 steps, but for our framework, we will continue to engage with stakeholders as we've done over the past 2 years. We have plans to pilot the framework and get more feedback from the people who use it in real practice. And of course, we will continue with dissemination activities. This webinar is one of them. And we intend to do training workshops around the application of the framework for this clinical trial networks. In the coming 2 slides or so, I'll be talking about some tools that we are developing to enhance the implementation of the framework in practice. Particularly, we are now undertaking 2 exercises. One task is the development of the weights. So we want to derive weights for the criteria that we have proposed in the framework. And we want to look, shortly we'll be sending surveys for consumers, researchers, and funders to see from the 3 perspectives how the 3 groups would, what weights and what preferences the 3 groups have for the criteria that we propose in the framework. And we are partnering with 1000 Minds, and we're using their software to do so. The other exercise that we will be doing is developing practical tools to help researchers and funders prospectively assess value for money. So explicitly comparing the benefits and costs of research proposals. And this is important for funders to ensure that the portfolio of proposals they're funding they're maximizing their return on research investment. And for researchers, it is important for them to demonstrate the value for money of their research proposals. And this is based on the notion that research is valuable because it reduces the chances of making wrong decisions. So we avoid the cost of making suboptimal investments. And at the same time, research will guide implementation efforts and change practice. And both elements can be monetized and compared to the cost of research, where we can estimate the return on investment. And put together this slide summarizing some important and recent publications around the use of quantitative approaches, such as value of information analysis, in guiding research prioritization in the UK, the US, and here in Australia. Before I close, I think it's about to take another poll where we are interested in your views. Would you be interested in workshops about quantitative approaches to prioritize research, such as the use of value of information analysis? So please select yes, or if you are interested, no if you're not. So if you haven't voted yet, please do so before we close. All right. Thank you very much for voting. Thank you. So this is the framework, and you will be receiving an email with a link to the full document where you can read the full details of the document of the framework, and actually our contact information are there if you want to engage with us and provide any feedback regarding that framework. In summary, research prioritization is critical to make the best use of available resources and to generate high quality evidence. Now, the prioritization process should be carefully planned and consider the scope, objectives, and available resources. Our framework provides a practical and flexible approach to guide research prioritization, and the criteria and tools that we suggest would facilitate the application of the framework in practice. with this, I'd like to thank you, and you can find the speaker's contact information. We'd appreciate your thoughts and feedback. And I think we've got time for questions. So over to you, Laurie.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel and Hytham. And folks, who will be posing questions to our speakers today. So if you do have a question that you'd like to pose to our speakers, please type them into the question panel that can be found to the right side of your screen, and I will read them off to our speakers on your behalf. So I'm going to keep an eye out for any questions coming in. I know it takes a moment to process what you've heard before you formulate any questions, but while we wait on that, just want to oh, looks like we did get a question already coming in. Hold on just a moment. As the questions come in, I'll be again giving voice, but just wanted to check in with our speakers if you had any comments you wanted to make before we get to the Q&A. I can start with you, Rachel.
Sure. I think one of the things that's really interesting is the criteria of equity. So some clinical trials networks and indeed some funders are interested in their research having a role in reducing inequities. And I just wondered, I guess it's more of a discussion point that might get some other people thinking, and Hytham, you might like to respond as well. Do you see that equity, which we have embedded in one of our criteria, might have different weightings depending on the objectives of different clinical trials networks or funders?
Yeah, yes, so exactly, Rachel, as you said, it's embedded within the relevance criteria. So we are taking equity as an element of having a proposal or a topic of being of relevance, because we want to achieve equity. However, if an organization felt that there is a need to enhance equity around for certain group or to improve equity, then maybe that component of the criterion can be actually weighted in a way to reflect its importance to the organization. So it would be interesting to see what the audience think about that.
All right. I do have a couple questions here. I've got one here for you, Hytham. We'll start with that one. Given the framework you have described, how long would you anticipate this process to take from start to end? And how often would you expect to be running through this process, for example, annually or when a new grant round opens, or et cetera?
That's an excellent question. The answer to this is it depends on the scope and objectives of and the capacity resources available within the organization. So if you are a large organization and you, let's say, you are funding a big round of, you have lots of proposals to consider. So definitely having a structured approach with the 10 steps maybe would be ideal. If you are a small organization or you have small number of applications or clinical trials to consider, then you might skip some of the components and merge some of them together and try to expedite the process. So if you have a short timeline, or if you want to finish this to meet a particular deadline, you can expedite some of the steps. Otherwise, you might extend that exercise if you need more information, you want to do some assessment and collect data. So it all depends on the leadership team of that prioritization exercise, the resources they have, and the objective they want to achieve.
Okay, thank you. Looks like this is a good question for both of you, but I'm going to start with you, Rachel. Are there examples of research prioritization available for consideration by CTNs?
Yes, there are. So one example that's really easy to access is SWOG, which is, I think, It might be Southwestern Oncology Group. It's certainly an oncology group in the United States, and they've published their prioritisation process. And so I think that's a really useful one, not just applicable to cancer trials, but it shows the process. Within the Australia-New Zealand landscape, ANZMUSC, the musculoskeletal group, has already published quite a bit of work they've done on their research prioritisation steps, both quantitative and qualitative. And another example would be the Australian Kidney Trials Network that have engaged particularly the James Lind Alliance approach, sort of a step-down JLA to topic prioritisation. And all of those works are published. Potentially what we could do is set up a repository for some of these studies and make them available to the webinar participants.
Okay, Hytham, do you have anything you'd like to add there?
No, these are all excellent examples, and I've provided in one of my slides some examples of using analytical approaches to prioritize research from the UK, the US, and Australia. And these are all real practice and real world examples.
Okay, I don't have any additional questions coming in the queue. Just wanted to give our speakers any opportunity they'd like to have some comments. Rachel, I see your hand up.
Yeah, sure. I was just thinking on that that first really good question about how often should you do this process and how long it takes. I think one of the other times that might prompt this process is when there is a real change in your trials landscape. So for instance, you know, sudden emergence of a new effective intervention. You know, it may be, you know, based on other people's trial results or your own trial results that suggests that there's some activity there that wasn't seen before. You could think, you know, for instance, in the case of immunotherapies in certain cancers, or it could be other interventions. And so because of that, there may be, you know, a scientific quality or appropriateness criterion that means it's important to assess the whole portfolio of research in light of new developments. So that was just one point I wanted to add to, I think it was Nisha's question.
Okay, well, Hytham, anything on your end?
Yes, this is exactly important, and some areas actually they are rapidly evolving, and we have new evidence being generated every day, and this is where I think the frequency of repeating the exercise will become important. So this is something for the leadership team to decide on the frequency of revisiting the priorities that they've established. Also depends on the level of prioritization. If we are talking about topics, so this is normally strategic directions. So we're looking at a national research agenda, for example. But when we're looking at prioritizing proposals for a particular funding round, so that's a short time frame objective.
Okay, I'm gonna okay. Not seeing any additional questions coming in at the moment. We can wait for just a couple moments to see if anything else comes in. And
so hopefully, yeah, so very soon we appreciate that if anyone also is interested to help us with further steps in the development of the tools and methods or participate in the survey. So we'll be very soon sending surveys to derive weights for the criteria that we're proposing in the framework. And also very soon we will be working on developing practical tools to estimate value for money or return on investment of research proposals.
Okay, looks like got a question in here. It's It's a long one, so I'm going to read it slowly. It's going over to you, Hytham, to
Hello.
start out. Question is, Rachel mentioned early on that there can be times when the weightings might need changing. For example, consumer priority is high need, but there's no way to test the intervention. In case I got the message wrong, should we be changing the weighting at that point, or should we spend more time trying to investigate how that priority could be researched rather than throwing it out?
If I understand this correctly, so are we talking about if, okay, so a new data emerges or there's something new that, and accordingly we want to change the weight of the criteria? Is that the question?
I think Hytham, I think my point was that it was really the question about, should all the criteria have equal weight? So if there's five criteria, they're each worth 20%, or should some criteria have more weight, a higher weight than others? And one of the discussion topics that's come up, and this is not uncommon, is when consumers or other stakeholders really say this is a problem area. You know, it's top priority for us, but at the same time there exists no sort of effective intervention that might be able to be tested in a randomized trial in order to address the topic. So it was really about should the criteria, you know, be the same? Should there be weighting in the criteria? And what methods, like using the multi-criteria decision analysis, might you have to assign your weightings? And then I guess this question is also about, do you then go back and change your weightings?
Yeah, so definitely that's an important question. Thank you. So the weight should reflect the importance of that criterion to the decision making. So it should reflect objectives and the scope of the exercise and what we want to achieve at the end. So if we believe that it's something important and we need to give it higher weight, then we can revisit that. And when we weight the criteria, and in order to get the aggregate score, we can revisit the weighting exercise and place more weight on that criterion that we believe is important to address. However, this should be balanced with the resources that we need to take in, and you know, revisiting the weighting and to do the exercise. The other thing I would like to emphasize here, that all these tools and criteria, they are just tools to help us making a decision. But at the end of the day, there are decision makers there. They will consider all the facts and considerations, and they will make a decision based on deliberations and discussions. So it's not just adding numbers together.
All right, well, that's all we have time for questions for today, but I'd like to thank both Rachel and Hytham, and on behalf of Australian Clinical Trials Alliance and our presenters, I would also like to thank all of you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.